All right, the first fighting in Poolesville actually would have started down the road, not too far from the elementary school. September 5th, 1862. What's happening is Lee's army is crossing the river. The Union Army has been defeated at Second Manassas, or Bull Run, as the Union would have called it. And they are actually moved into the defenses of Washington. Lee and Stonewall Jackson had tried to get around their side, and had failed to. And so Lee was crossing the river not far from here, up at White's Ford, not the ferry. And his main army had crossed there, but he's trying to keep his cavalry, his mounted men, between his Confederate army and the Union Army. And the cavalry, by the time of the Civil War, these guys have the ability to fight on horseback. They carry smaller rifles. They're not as effective in terms of their range, but because they're on horseback, these guys can travel 110, 120 miles in a day, as opposed to the 20 a foot soldier could do. So one of the big jobs of cavalry was to try and find out what your opponent was doing, and at the same time try and keep their cavalry from finding out what you were doing. Also, you would use your cavalry to conduct raids to try and cut off supplies, try and keep your enemy off balance, and then you would use cavalry to counter those raids. So those were sort of the role of the cavalry in the Civil War. Well, in the first few days of September 1862, the fighting in Poolesville is going to be an almost exclusively cavalry affair. And so a brigade, at this time probably down to about 12 or 1,500 soldiers, have crossed, the Virginians have crossed from Lee's army at Edwards Ferry, and they are coming down this street here, right? So the reason they're coming down this street is because the road from Edwards Ferry leads here. So the same reason that John Poole built his store here is the same reason why on September 5th there's a small group of Union soldiers here. It's because all the roads from the ferries and the fords end up in Poolesville. So if Lee's army has crossed, they want to know where and what direction he's moving. So they left a small force in Poolesville. Now, earlier in the war, we'll talk about the encampments in 1861. And so these Union soldiers were actually out in the direction of the elementary school, and they were holding there when Fitz-Lee's brigade of Confederate cavalry comes sweeping in. He's actually going to capture most of them. But the Union soldiers, who are outnumbered something like 1,500 guys to 60, they realize they're going to lose. And so they try and fight what you would call holding action. They would have guys stand there and try and fire around to slow down the Confederates, and then they would get on their horses and head back through town. And so literally the Confederates would have chased the Union guys through town in this direction. So this is the area of the September 5th fighting. And since I'm here, we might as well talk about June of 1863. There wasn't fighting in Poolesville in June of 1863, but most of the Union Army of the Potomac, the largest Union Army, the largest northern U.S. Army in existence, actually most of it came through Poolesville. And four of the 7 corps, most of them will end up moving up to Frederick. General Joseph Hooker, who was the commander of the Union Army, actually spent at least one night here in town. And so you had probably 70,000 troops, 60,000 troops maybe, Union troops marching through here. Lee had crossed further north, and so there wasn't any fighting here during the Gettysburg campaign, or what you would call the second invasion. September 1862 It's the Antietam campaign, or the first invasion. That's when there was fighting. So Fisher Avenue, which is now 109 through town here, was paved in 1921. It's when most of the towns around Poolesville got their names, when they were paving them. This saw the bulk of the fighting on September 5th. The bigger fighting, the bigger battle on the 8th of September in particular, are going to be fought along the other road coming into town. So we'll go out there and talk about that. Thanks.